I'm out on a walk today and I'm going to be talking about using cookies for persistent UI state. So firstly, just to backtrack, set the scene a little bit, what I'm trying to do is set up light mode, dark mode preferences for a user. And I also want to store the sidebar width. So the application I'm working on has a sidebar which can be resized. And so ideally when the user requests a new page, they refresh, the theme that they've selected is there in that initial render. They don't sort of have it flash as the other one theme, say the default theme, and then flash the one they wanted. And also I want the sidebar width to be correct, from the get-go. It doesn't kind of change after that initial render. So what options do I have available? We can kind of think about state in different categories. So firstly, you could think of state as really anything you put in a variable in JavaScript in some way. It kind of lives on the user's browser. When they refresh, it's kind of cleared, right? That's like non-persistent state. It's cleared all the time. You've then got state you can keep on the user's client, right? So I'm thinking things like local storage, session storage, local DB. They're things that the user has access to on their client, but the server can't get to. So those mechanisms are helpful, but they're not all that helpful for server-side rendering. So server-side rendering with React, usually you need to have kind of all the values you want in order to correctly set the props you want them to be in your React render. Now, there is a little bit of an asterisk there. You technically can use some of those apparatus, but it's a bit kind of off the beaten path. And what you would do is, potentially in the head of your document, you could read from local storage. So this is before the page is rendered, and then set potentially like some CSS variables or things like that. And you could use those in your application, right? And the server would never know about those. However, I haven't really gone down that path too much. There's definitely a place for exploring things like that, but I didn't need it. If you're using, say, React for server-side rendering, you are kind of fighting the React paradigm where you're sort of putting all the values in props and having them in state. If you're using React and you're doing that other approach, you kind of need to either let something else own the state for those values and kind of communicate with React, or somehow after the render, get it into React. It kind of gets a bit messy. So I didn't go down that path. What other options sort of are there, right? You could think of the URL as a great way to store state. This is used really, it's super common especially for search kind of pages. So on Amazon, as you're typing in, search parameters and you're updating the filters on the side, the URL is updating at the same time, so that when you refresh the page, hopefully you'll see very similar results, right? All those sort of query parameters all the parts that make up the query kind of persisted. So you definitely can use this to store UI state, but it's not really, you're not really seeing in the URL sort of the user's theme or the sidebar width, right? Because you can share URLs. If you shared this URL with a friend, you probably wouldn't want them seeing dark mode just because you had selected dark mode, right? So there's some things that are kind of per user that you won't put in there. So the other kind of option that I see super common that's reached for is the database, right? You have some UI state. If you have an authenticated user, you can put that. You can have a table where you store their sort of preferences, their settings, and then when you're doing a server-side render, you can pull those out. I had this wired up in my application, so I was using a React server component that would, await a DB query to get these values and then put them as props to a component, and then I would have a React server action, which would be called when those values changed, and it would update the database, right? Now, you don't need to use a React server component, like any endpoint, right? But the idea is that on your client, when they change the theme or they change the sidebar width, in my case, you fire off some request to the server to say, hey, this value changed, can you please persist this? And then the plan is that, next time then they refresh, those data values are there and you can put them in, use them in your render, and you're kind of good to go. And this works reasonably well. This is really common. But that approach, there are some complexities in doing it well at scale. So for example, like let's say you had a user who used multiple devices, okay? How do you make sure that, like, and you want them to be able to have, say, light mode on one device, dark mode on another, or different sidebar widths. You know, if you don't add any kind of extra logic there, they're going to be clashing with each other, right? And that may not be what the user wants. So you might have to store like some device information sort of in there in the database, which isn't ideal. Also, this is not a problem that's unique to UI state, but you can end up in some sort of strange race conditions. Like if you had a few, well, let's say you fire off a request to change the theme to the back end, and that request, for whatever reason, kind of gets delayed. Then the user refreshes and they refresh the page, and that value was not persisted to the database yet. They'll get the old one, right? The old theme value in their original render, the old sidebar value, sidebar width value. Which then, yeah, strangely, like maybe that other request kind of did persist after that render, and then when they refresh again, it's kind of different. You can kind of get into these weird kind of cases. Another case would be if they had like multiple tabs open and you were doing a few different things in them. There's no guarantee when you send off these asynchronous requests that the last one sent will be the one that persists, right? It's sort of like whichever one is the last request to happen to arrive will be the one that persists. Now you can build your own logic around that. So you may send a timestamp along with the request, and you can say, hey, only update the value if the timestamp is newer than the one I've stored. So the last one wins. But again, it's just logic you have to write, own, kind of manage in that space. That said, at the end of the day, like theme preference, sidebar width, like it's not the biggest problem if there's some race conditions there, or, you know, the values coming out of sync, like it's not, you know, mission critical kind of stuff, and it's pretty easy to change. But, you know, I think it's worth thinking through how to get a good outcome there. Another option is session storage. So honestly, I'm not crazy familiar with like the goings on in the back end these days, but when I used to work more kind of on the back end and had persistent web servers, you had this, like the ability to put stuff in the session, because the backend kind of knew about you. And there are modern equivalents which will effectively create a little database for you and be aware of the current user's session. And those things are cool. By the end of the day, it's still just like a database that you're putting something into. But also session storage isn't the best choice for, say, theme, where, you know, if they log in, log out, come back a week later, they shouldn't necessarily like lose their theme preferences, their sidebar width. Like we kind of want to persist that stuff for a longer period of time, right? So enter a solution that I hadn't considered, and that is cookies. But a colleague at work was sort of talking about it, how they were using it in another project, and it was really successful. And I kind of started using it. I'm like, oh, I can see why this is a really interesting pattern. And that's where you put some of this UI state in a cookie, right? So you put in, say, a key into the cookies called theme, value dark, and then the server in its server-side render has access to the cookies, can pull out that data and use it and just pump it into the props for React components, and you're kind of good to go, right? So this is a really interesting pattern because it has a few really nice advantages. One is the race conditions sort of go away. So cookies are, you know, last write wins on the user's local machine. So whatever the user selected last, that'll be the one that's persisted. Sorry, that'll be the one that's like set there. When the user sends off a request, like you know that they have the latest value because it was done locally. It's sent off to the server, and you know they have access to it, which is really cool. It allows some really interesting flexibility. So you remove this category of race conditions. One of those conditions I mentioned, which is where you send off a request, it hasn't persisted, you refresh, you get the wrong value, like that problem goes away. The next sort of case where you had, you know, potentially multiple devices for the same, and the user was logged into a few different devices and they wanted to have different settings on those, that's kind of handled for you because cookies are per device, right? So you could use light mode on your iPad, but use dark mode on your desktop. And that's totally fine. Like, even if you like the same theme, like you might want a different sidebar width on your iPad, right? Because the screen real estate is different. By using cookies, you unlock the ability to have per device settings without you having to write kind of any code for it, right? You're just sort of using cookies, using this very well-supported browser feature. Now, every solution has its benefits as well as its drawbacks. So when we're thinking about cookies, it has some pretty significant drawbacks. So a cookie is sent with every single request you send to the server will have that, whatever information you put in the cookie will be sent along with that request. So if you just start putting heaps of stuff in there, you're going to start weighing down or slowing down your experience, right? Because you're adding more and more data in there. Also, cookies have a limit of 4 kilobytes of data, which is not a lot. And so you can't necessarily just be chucking lots of things in there. Also, browser, I'm not sure if this has changed, but I remember it being that, say if you add too much data in there, things can go weird. Like browsers may just decide, I'm going to stop letting you add things. Yeah, it's not really a place you want to be, right? So I think there is a little bit of a danger there with using cookies for this type of thing, is that you want to be pretty sparing with what you put in there because you want to make sure that you're pretty well underneath that cap. Now, if you're using JSON web tokens, like I was just looking at one today that my app uses, and it's like close to 2 kilobytes in itself, which only leaves 2 kilobytes for everything else. So I kind of have to be a bit careful, a bit sparing in what I put in there. It seems like using cookies for these high-level UI kind of preferences has some really nice advantages. I'm kind of enjoying using it. It has unlocked some pretty interesting value. I'll see how it goes over the next while. I might end up kind of going back to the database approach, but I have found it to be quite interesting. I guess a drawback of using cookies as well is, like, let's say you set your user went, I want to set light theme for this experience. Like, would a user expect that they'd have to reset light theme on like every device? That's not ideal, but how I've kind of justified that to myself is that by default, I respect the system preference. That feels like a nice sort of middle ground. So you say, okay, I'm going to respect the system preference for the theme unless they've explicitly said I want, light or dark. And then if they've explicitly set that, it'll be stored on that device, but then on other devices, it'll be different, right? It feels like that's actually kind of a nice thing because, then you're kind of by default respecting the devices. But yeah, I mean, it is a trade-off. You have to decide, like, if they've said light on one device, does that mean I want light on everything? I've kind of, for now, landed on the idea that it's a per device setting. But yeah, I'm happy to kind of think more about that. I hope you've enjoyed our time together. I'll catch you next time.